So again, before we kind of move on, I just want to make the point maybe that my own personal theme for today is balance. It's a balance between the role of the university and the role of the state. We are a public university, we are interested in the public good. But we also have to be careful not to instrumentalise what we do. In other words, that everything we do is about economy or whatever, and we only teach the things that people can do. We need to have that space in our work that is for that blue sky, that opportunity for the future. But in this context, for this purpose, we are about actually being really focused on those important questions. In our institute, that is really significant. It is about that closeness to policy and practice and making a difference to people, ultimately, to citizens, to children, to young people, to older adults, to people with disabilities, to excluded groups in particular. I suppose I was thinking about this in terms of a metaphor on this is, I suppose, an accordion, so if we hold it apart, then that's maybe at certain times we have to be apart, but then we have to squeeze and we have to get in close to each other and have these kinds of opportunities. So this is an accordion day in my head and how we work together. And again, just to reference again the significance of the work today, it is so central to what we do. It is so central to what we do in our centre and in the centres and affiliates and affiliated individuals to our work. So it's really exciting and delighted to have everybody here. Just to say the structure for today, I think you're familiar with it. We're going to start with Sally as a plenary, then we're going to move on. Anuna is going to do a plenary for us, and then we're going to have our first panel session. And just before lunch, we're just going to do a quick check-in on how you're getting on and what you think about what you're hearing. So I'm going to leave it at that now because we're obviously, as you can see, we're probably a good bit behind time. So we're just going to maybe start now with Sally, and I'm going to introduce Sally to us. I'm going to start by apologising to Sally for keeping her waiting. I know she's up doing this work for us, and it's inconvenient. She'd love to be here. She was very disappointed she couldn't be because she's going to be in Europe soon. But just to introduce, Sally is Practice Fellow for Policy Capability and Public Management at the Australia and New Zealand School of Government based in Wellington, Aotearoa in New Zealand. She established and was the inaugural director of the New Zealand Policy Project based in the New Zealand Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. She's worked with the OECD and has consulted to the UN Food and Agricultural Organization and the OECD, and she's numerous publications, and she's a significant, if you want, global leader on public policy and effective public policy and support to national governments and global governance processes. So we're really, really fortunate to have her here this morning, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. And hello, Sally, and thanks again for participating. And I'm just going to hand over to you now, okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Kia ora tātou, ko Sally Washington, tōku ingoa, tēnā koutou katoa. New Zealand, we try and introduce ourselves in Te Reo Māori, the Indigenous language of the people of New Zealand. And it's about acknowledging them, but it's also about making connection. And I hear that you do that in Ireland as well. And often in New Zealand, we will also say where we come from. So we call that the whakapapa. So what is your background? And that is also about making connection. And I'd just like to say now that I'm 44% Irish, my DNA tells me, so I feel like I'm with family now, and you can think of me as family. But getting back to this connection point, I think that's what engagement is all about, is how do we connect with people who will be affected by policy and include them in the decision-making process. And I know you're going to hear lots of really detailed cases today about actual engagements and how they've influenced policy. So I want to focus on the policy system and the role of engagement in that. So it'll be much more of a systemic talk. So hang on, now my is not working. What is happening? There we go. So what I want to talk about is engagement for better decision making, but to think about it in the context of what I call the policy infrastructure. So what are the components that come together to make a good policy process? And then I want to talk about the why, so why we would engage, who with, when, how, so what process for what purpose, and so what does that mean for how we do policy and for civil service capability? And then I want to think about what next. So what can you do, whether you're an academic or whether you're in the civil service or civil society, what can you do to improve engagement for better policy? So this is what I call the policy infrastructure, and you can see that engagement is a key component of this. And if you're interested in this paper, that I'm going to give you a whole list of resources at the end. But I find that most jurisdictions around the world and organisations, when they're trying to improve their policy capability and their policy quality, they focus very much on the supply side. And I think that means, so for me, engagement is a very big part of that. So how to do engagement, how to engage outside. But I'm also really interested in this demand side, and I think we often forget about that. So how do we understand the demand for policy? And that doesn't just mean with stakeholders and the people who will be affected, but also with the decision makers. So how do we engage with them? And I just dig down into that a little bit more. So this policy infrastructure I use a little bit as a maturity model. So it's a way that you could even use it as an assessment for policy capability in an organisation or across a system. So in terms of engagement, and there are lots of lines of inquiry for each of these components. But so on that side, the left-hand side for engagement. So I'm thinking about how do we serve ministers and cabinet, and I think we really have to recognise that our politicians are out there all the time talking to people, and I think as policymakers, we don't do that, and we don't do that enough. We need to know what they're seeing and hearing so we can keep up with the influences on them. And somebody mentioned a little bit, was Liz mentioned before, about how do we collaborate also across other parts of government and our partners. So it's not just policy people having the great idea and throwing it over the fence to delivery people, but how do we work across that whole, engage across that whole value chain in policy. But I think the two areas that we're focusing on most today is working with stakeholders, so understanding those special interest groups, but also with customers and those end users, so the people who will be affected by policy. And on the right-hand side, so another huge part of this policy infrastructure is thinking about policy quality systems. And that's where I see the policy handbook sitting too. So it includes guidance for civil servants as they're working on policy, and it's part of the toolkits, methods, models, understanding the evidence base, and is also an anchor for quality assurance. But it's very much a process model. And I think actually that's missing in a lot of countries, and including in my own. And even though the policy handbook's a little bit draws on my model, I can't say that it's well embedded in my own country. I think sometimes we have more impact outside our own countries. So why engage? And I think, as others have said, the policy handbook includes these three pillars, and I think they're all they say right up front why it's important to engage outside of government. So building legitimacy and trust through participation. And we know in New Zealand we have a thing called Kiwis Count, which is a survey of Kiwis to understand how satisfied they are with government services. And we know that the closer they are to a service and the more involved they are, the more accepting they are and the more they understand it. And I think that's a really key thing about understanding the importance of engagement. It also helps us to reframe evidence, and I'm really interested in this notion of lived experience as well. So I think in traditional policy, we think about evidence as data and research, but I think it's also how do we build even more sources and include that in what is evidence, and particularly this lived experience. How do people live their lives, and how do we put that into our policy as well? And how do we build that then into our advice for decision makers? So we're not the decision makers, the political class are the decision makers, but how do we advise them well by including all of this different evidence from outside government? It's also about de-risking implementation. So the more engagement we have, the more we understand how policies will land, and even to the point of involving others in delivery. So it might be a co-delivery process. And I think about New Zealand was very successful in its initial response to COVID, but not with Māori and Pacifica populations. And it wasn't until they were really engaged and part of the process, and we realised that that vaccinations and working with COVID needed a special kind of engagement with them. We needed to understand what would work for them. So I think it's really important, this understanding how things will land and how to implement, and engagement is very much part of that story. And then better policy, better outcomes. But it's also, I think, feeds into this notion that democracy is changing and it's becoming, some people talk about a deliberative wave, but we're going beyond this, thinking that we can just have our representatives knowing everything and being able to make decisions for us, but how does the rest of society get involved in decision making as part of the growth and the development of our democracies? And just a couple of quotes here, but the wonderful Alistair Campbell, love him or hate him, but he says people feel much more directly involved, that we need a new system where that's going to happen. The quote in the middle is from our Indigenous populations in Australia and New Zealand, mainly in Australia actually, but I think it's a really good mantra. So nothing about us without us. So how do we include people in our decision making? But an academic colleague from Australia points out that the public is so divided from itself and from public institutions now, so that complicates the whole process of engagement. But I'm really pleased. I think the 3 pillars in the handbook really give voice to why engage outside of government. So next, who to engage with, which is the next question. And of course, that also all depends on the purpose of your engagement and what impact you expect on the decision. So obviously the International Association for Public Participation has this spectrum of engagement from informing up to empowering, which suggests a different level of impact on the decision. And also how we engage depends on the kind of challenge, the scale and the scope of the challenge. And I use this diagram that not all policy is created equally, usually just to say, that we need a lot more wraparound if it's something that's a big transformation versus something that it's a small transactional or tweak to the status quo. And I think I've added in the level of engagement there because I think if something is very transformative, then that requires an extra level of engagement. And then the next thing is it targeted engagement, or are we engaging everybody? Do we include everybody in the engagement? And I think that depends on who is the public and who is your public. So usually it's our peak bodies get involved, and we know who our stakeholders are, and we talk to the loudest voices, but it's not one size fits all. How do we talk to those silent groups? And somebody mentioned those before: youth, elderly, different ethnic groups, and Indigenous populations that might require a different kind of engagement and certainly have different needs and experiences with policy. I also think it's a really important thing to think about relational versus transactional. So we don't want transactional where you just go to people and say when you want something. So there's a whole body of public administration research at the moment thinking about more relational government. So how do we build relationships with groups so that we don't have to go to them just at a particular point and say, what do you think of my great policy, or how can you help me with this? But that we've already built up those relationships. And I call this relationship capital that we invest in and then we can draw on when we need it. But I think it's really important to understand what influence we expect the engagement to have. So how much power are we going to give up when we engage? So, and the other question is, when do we engage in the policy process? And I think both you'll see in the policy handbook, we've both got 5D. So this is my model against the department, the civil services 5D policy process. But I think both of them show that engagement should occur throughout the policy process. And I think in the past, we've just had, when we looked at that old policy cycle, that's often used as an heuristic for for teaching policy and doing policy, we'd have a section of that, a phase of the policy process that was called consult, which was just one process. And what your diagram from the policy handbook and what my diagram from the 5D policy advice model shows that engagement needs to happen throughout the process. And mine has an animation too, which I think has really resonated with people. So you might like to have a look at that later. But when I think about the different parts of the 5D, so you might engage for understanding demand, so understanding at the agenda setting stage, so what's important, understanding priorities. At the discover stage, so understanding what the evidence is, how are things working out or not, and how do we get that information and include that in our evidence. At the design stage of policy, how do we engage people in designing new options? What's going to land? How can we involve them in that? And then even in the decide stage, which for me is how do we give good advice to decision makers, so the political side. And I think about even how we can involve people in that process. So, for example, in New Zealand, after the devastating earthquakes in Christchurch, we, instead of giving a dry cabinet paper to ministers in a cabinet committee, we invited people who'd been involved in innovations in the public service and in collaboration with NGOs and others and the private sector in that city. We brought them to Wellington and had almost like a speed dating session with ministers. So even at that level, we can involve outsiders, and especially at this delivery stage. So that's implementation, which might include co-delivery of the policy, and definitely will include bringing people into the evaluation and the monitoring of the policy. Somebody's going to have to tell me how my timing is going. And I think when I think about the civil service, we need to think about how to engage. What does it mean for the civil service operating model and capability if we're going to be building engagement into our policy? And I think about these as critical components. And if anybody's seen any of my work, you know that I'm an infrastructure queen. I think the notion of infrastructure really helps me to understand the world and to explain the world. So in terms of engagement, I think about these critical components that all need to be mutually reinforcing. So these system enablers, having a mandate and expectations of engagement, and I think you have that now from the handbook. It gives a mandate. The Civil Service Board and the Taoiseach have given permission for engagement, and I know sometimes it's the issues are too sensitive that you need to have a specific permission. But I think in general we need to say it's expected and we have permission for it. Leaders and organisations need to emphasise the importance of engagement, and also allocate resources, systems, and socialise the importance of engagement in their departments. Organisational capability, we need that. And I think most departments and most systems that I've seen around the world have some sort of engagement expert in their staff, but they usually only consulted at the end. They're usually only brought into the process at the end. So how do we think about bringing those people into the process, so that we're not just bringing them in at the end where they're trying to sell a process? And I want to dig into these last two, methods and toolkits and skills and mindsets. So in terms of methods for engagement, we need to understand that there are so many of them. And I've put this diagram from the UK Policy Lab, which I think has a wealth of good information and tools in it, and against the methods from the IAP2 spectrum of engagement. And those methods can be something like frameworks. So I really like the Stanford Collective Impact Model. That's influenced a lot of work that I've done. We've got the system mapping, all sorts of things that we can call as frameworks that are part of setting up engagement. There are platforms and software, even something like SurveyMonkey, Discourse. I know that the UK have just, the Institute for Government there has just done a piece of work on Consult, which is an AI tool, and they say that it's 1,000 times faster at summarising submissions that are coming into government. There are methods, town halls, focus groups, citizen juries, mini publics, referenda, citizens' assemblies, and I know Ireland is the poster child for citizens' assemblies, so everybody always refers to you when they're talking about citizens' assemblies. And then there's other tools like using AI or digital electronic signatures, all those sorts of things. I read a piece recently, and I've put it in the references for you, about using digital twins in the policy process. But I think whatever the method, we need to understand the purpose of that method, when to use it, how to use it, and the costs and benefits. And that needs to be included in guidance in a policy toolkit. And I'm pleased to hear that there's work ongoing in that in Ireland. But New Zealand has some guidelines, the UK does, the OECD has some references that I put in the references for you. But I think the key thing is that to understand is that I think, when I started in policy many years ago, it was really a desk-based process. But now it's much broader than that. There's more deliberation, and we need to include a lot more engagement outside of government. It's not just sitting at your desk and doing some research. And I was in a part of a workshop recently with New Zealand policy people, and I think there's a bit of a reluctance to go out and talk to people. They think it's risky. And maybe politically risky as well. But I think there are also other tools that we can use that are not direct engagement, but help you to walk in the shoes of people with different needs in different parts of the population, like using personas, and some of those design methods I think are really, really useful as well when you can't go directly out. And then in terms of skills, what sort of skills do we need in the civil service to be able to effectively engage? And this is adapted from the original New Zealand policy skills framework, which was something that I led when I was leading the policy project in New Zealand. But thinking, we had engagement and collaboration as one of the key skills for policy people, and the definition there. But is also, all of these skills are articulated in terms of somebody just starting out, somebody that's a safe pair of hands, and somebody who's an expert in their field. But I think it talks about building and using collaborative networks, being able to design an engagement process, being able to use citizen-centric approaches. And I think as government gets less the strict doer, but more a broker, facilitator, and a catalyst, this sort of convening and curating skills are going to be more and more important for civil servants. And it's something we need to start building now. And what could possibly go wrong? So things all right. So some of these things to consider. And of course, we often think about the time and the cost involved in an engagement process. Facilitators, venues, travel, logistics. But I always think of the counterfactual when I think about cost and effort, and sometimes it's a notion of taking time to make time. So the more upfront the more we front load engagement, the less problems with engagement we're going to get at the other end. Of course, there are risks, whether those are risks to relationships, reputational, political risks, when something goes wrong. But the status quo is also a risk. Often we don't think about the change. When we think about a change, we don't think about the risk of not doing something. And of course, there's often this fatigue with engagement when we're going to people all the time, or the same people all the time asking the same question. We've had an example in New Zealand. We have what we call long-term insights briefings. Every head of government department has to produce a futures report, and it's supposed to be once every 3 years, but they're all at the same time. So we had every department going out to the public saying, what's the key issues that you think are coming in the future in this area. So you get to this engagement fatigue, which we have to really be wary of. And we've all seen engagements that don't work. So especially things like referenda. The voice referendum in Australia recently was a disaster because people weren't set up to make an informed decision. We had a similar one in New Zealand to change our flag, which I would have loved to have seen our flag change. You can see it on my screensaver at the back, but because it looks very much like the Australian flag, and most of us don't know the difference between the two of them. But it was a flawed process. I think the key role for policy people in terms of engagement too is being able to balance the competing interests and views and make some sense of that. And that's something often you hear that people talking about digital or AI is going to be able to help with that. I think that's the key thing that humans will have to do, is to be able to, that we have to be the sense makers and understand the bias and have the ability to summarize and get some clarity out of that in order to advise our decision makers. The thing that we need to also be aware of is being really clear about who has the final say on who has decision rights and the accountability that sits around that. And most importantly, I think, is that we need to communicate the expectations. So we need to communicate the final decision and how and why it was taken. And there's some guidelines there from the OECD, but I think that is so important, because often we raise expectations by engaging with people, and then if we're not going to take any notice of what they say, and then it's almost worse than doing nothing. I just wanted to put, for today, I wanted to put some slight provocations to you. Just I ran a session recently with senior officials from Australia and New Zealand, and we asked them, it was actually a future session, but we asked them to think about what they could do themselves, what they could do in their teams to build anticipatory governance into their organisations, and what needed to change at the system level. And they all put everything almost at the system level without sort of acknowledging the irony that senior civil servants are the system. So, and we're all part of the system, so we all need to be part of changing it. I wanted to just set out what some provocations for the different groups in the room. So in terms of civil servants or public servants, how do we build engagement into our departmental processes? So, and giving some guidance to civil servants with that. Be proactive, and I think this is, not waiting for the permission, but going out there. So also thinking, going out, so taking the inside out, but also outside in, inviting other people, other voices into our discussions. We need to build these engagement muscles and mindsets. So that's part of the skills process. Really test and learn, experiment, and we're going to learn a lot along the way. So and share those lessons. And I think really you've got an anchor now with the policy handbook to be able to do that and also as an anchor for other things like quality assurance processes. What does good quality policy look like, and how might we measure it against some quality standards? For the academics in the room, I think there's a lot to be done in terms of analysing the different methods for engagement, how useful they are, when you would use them, how, and I'd really love to see a decision tree, so some kind of analytical framework to understand what method to use when, for what purpose, at what stage of the policy process, or in what combinations. I think that would be really helpful. Obviously, collaboration on engagements, and I know that a lot of people in the room are very involved in that already, and helping to translate the evidence from the engagement, from the work and the research that you do in this knowledge brokering role, and supporting the capability build of the civil service. So referencing the handbook in both your teaching and research. I think that's all I'm going to say. I've got a whole pile of references and resources that we can share my slides afterwards. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
So, Sally, thank you so much. That was really, really excellent, and exactly what we needed to start us off today. I think you've hit the ball in the back of the net, or whatever sporting metaphor you want to use. Really, really helpful. I particularly like just the fact that it's laid out for us, this, and also finishing there with some challenges to both the civil servants in the room, but also the academics in terms of how we look at this in a detailed way. So we're way behind time, but I certainly would like to hear maybe one or two questions from the audience for Sally before we let her go. So if somebody's got a question. Yeah, so one here.
Sorry, Barry Vaughan, Department Taoiseach. I think we've already noted our debt to you, Sally. I think, was it you who coined the phrase that we should steal?
Yeah, I think it should be family hold back.
Yeah, you should say we should steal with abandon. So certainly we've stolen with abandon from you. So thanks very much. Just something I'm interested in, as you said, we're currently working on guidelines, and it's that interface with the political system at the decision stage. So traditionally, I think the civil service have said, well, we'll do the analysis, and the ministers and then their advisors will bring in the political considerations. And I think you seem to be saying is that the civil service, the public service, should be kind of going out earlier, getting a sense check of what they're being exposed to and building that into the analysis. Is that correct? Because I think that's a very interesting idea, because it seems to me there's a bit of a black box about what we do with all these public submissions and so on. And we summarise them, but how we actually use them in our decision making is still quite opaque. So I'd just be interested in what you think about that.
So in terms of the political side, definitely that's what I'm saying. I think that's why I build that demand side into the policy infrastructure. I think we need to I think we need to bring decision makers in up front in the policy process as well. So have more open discussions with decision makers about what they want, what they're trying to achieve. And because they're out and about all the time, we need to understand who they're talking to, who's influencing them, what voices they prioritise. And even so I give masterclasses on political nous or political savvy, and even, understanding if it's a particular minister, what their electorate is, what people think there, what are the key issues, so that you can actually build your advice around a better understanding of the decision maker and what's going to land with them, as well as the influences and the voices that they're hearing. So I think, we often talk about civil servants being apolitical. I don't think we should be apolitical. I think we should be politically neutral in terms of party politics, but I think we need to be very politically savvy.
Has a question? It's surprising for a group like this that there isn't a question. I see one over on the far side, yeah.
Hi, my name is Pat Osborne. I work in Tusla. I'd like to ask you a question about the need to proactively reach out and engage. It's about hitting those people that we don't always hear from, and if you have any advice or guidance on that.
I don't know about advice or guidance, but I remember my first policy role was in our Ministry of Women's Affairs when it was first set up, and one of the first things we did was to get different groups of women to come into the ministry. So we had like a day for Māori women, a day for Pacifica women, a day for women with disabilities, just to try and understand how they were experiencing government at that point. So I guess it is about being proactive and building those relationships, so that when you actually need to, you need those voices and those insights for particular pieces of policy, that you've already built the relationship.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I think I probably need to move on. But just to say, Sally, so you're part of the Department of the Taoiseach's family. I hope you're part of our family in ILAS, and we're delighted to have made the connection with you. We look forward to circulating your slides and also the sources that you're providing, I think, which will be very useful. So maybe just to finish by saying thanks again to Sally for her contribution this morning.